I never thought a dusty box in my grandfather's attic would turn my entire world upside down. My name is James Mitchell, and I'm a 34-year-old history teacher at Lincoln High School in Richmond, Virginia. For years, I've taught World War II with the same textbooks, the same photos, the same stories everyone knows. But what I found on that cold February afternoon in 2024 would challenge everything I thought I knew about D-Day. My grandfather, Robert Mitchell, passed away 3 months earlier at the age of 98. He'd been a combat photographer during the war, stationed with the 1st Infantry Division. Growing up, I'd heard fragments of stories, but Grandpa was never one to talk much about his time in France. He'd get this distant look in his eyes whenever June 6th rolled around, and we learned not to push. The attic of his old colonial house in Alexandria smelled like mothballs and aged wood. Boxes were stacked everywhere, filled with a lifetime of memories. My mother had asked me to help sort through his belongings, and honestly, I'd been putting it off. Grief has a way of making even simple tasks feel impossible. I was about to call it a day when I noticed a small metal box wedged behind an old trunk. It was olive green, military issue, with rust creeping along its edges. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it free. The lock had long since corroded, and the lid opened with a groan that seemed too loud in the silent attic. Inside were dozens of photographs, but these weren't the ones we'd seen in family albums. These were original negatives and prints, some damaged by time, others surprisingly well preserved. I carefully lifted them out, one by one, studying faces frozen in moments of fear, exhaustion, and determination. And then I saw it. The photograph was black and white, slightly creased at one corner. It showed a section of Omaha Beach, but something was off. In the foreground, American soldiers were taking cover behind a disabled landing craft. The image captured the chaos everyone knows from D-Day, the horror and confusion. But in the background, partially obscured by smoke, was something that made my blood run cold. There was a second wave of landing crafts approaching the beach, but their markings were wrong. They weren't American. They weren't British or Canadian either. The vessels bore markings I'd never seen in any historical documentation of the Normandy invasion. And standing on one of those crafts, clearly visible despite the smoke, was a group of soldiers in uniforms that didn't match any Allied forces I'd studied. I sat there on the attic floor for what felt like hours, the photograph trembling in my hands. The timestamp on the back read 0645 hours, June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Sector Dog Green. My grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable, the same careful script he'd used to label all his photos. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe it was a training exercise he'd mislabeled. Maybe the markings were just obscured by damage to the negative. But as I examined it more closely with the magnifying glass I'd brought for reading old documents, the details became clearer. These weren't American troops. The uniforms, the equipment, even their stance was different. I pulled out my phone and took several high-resolution photos of the original. My hands were shaking so badly that the first few came out blurred. When I finally got a clear shot, I immediately started researching. For the next 3 hours, I sat in that attic, cross-referencing the image with every piece of D-Day documentation I could find online. Nothing matched. The light was fading when I finally descended from the attic, the metal box clutched under my arm. My mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She looked up as I entered, and her expression shifted from neutral to concerned. "James, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, wiping her hands on a dish-tag towel. "What did you find up there?" I set the box on the kitchen table, carefully removing the photograph. "Mum, did Grandpa ever talk about anything unusual he photographed during the war? Anything he was told to keep quiet about?" She frowned, moving closer to examine the image. "Your grandfather photographed thousands of images during the war. Most of them ended up in military archives. Why?" "Look at this," I said, pointing to the background vessels. "These markings, these uniforms, I can't find them in any historical record of D-Day." My mother studied the photo for a long moment, then shook her head. "I don't know, honey. Dad kept a lot bottled up inside. There were things he would never discuss, no matter how much we asked. He always said some stories were meant to stay buried. That phrase haunted me through dinner and long into the night. Some stories were meant to stay buried. But why? What had my grandfather witnessed that day on Omaha Beach that was so sensitive it needed to remain hidden for 80 years? I couldn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, I was at my desk, the photograph illuminated by my lamp, making notes and sketching details. The more I looked, the more questions emerged. The uniforms suggested a military force, but which one? The equipment was advanced for 1944, almost too advanced. And why would their presence be scrubbed from every official record? By dawn, I'd made a decision. I needed to know the truth, not just for historical accuracy, but because this was my grandfather's legacy. He'd kept this photo for a reason. Maybe he'd wanted someone to find it eventually. Maybe he'd wanted the truth to come out after he was gone. I called in sick to school that morning, something I rarely did. Instead, I spent the day scanning the photograph at the highest resolution possible and reaching out to colleagues in the historical community. I was careful not to reveal too much in my initial inquiries, just asking general questions about lesser-known Allied forces during D-Day. The responses were uniform. There were no unaccounted-for forces at Omaha Beach. The order of battle was meticulously documented. Every unit, every soldier, every vessel was recorded in the official histories, but I had a photograph that said otherwise. 3 days after finding the photograph, I was sitting in a small cafe in Arlington, waiting for someone who might have answers. Through a World War II veterans forum, I'd connected with a 96-year-old former intelligence officer named Thomas Brennan. He'd served in the same division as my grandfather, though they hadn't known each other personally. When I'd mentioned I had questions about classified aspects of D-Day, he'd agreed to meet, but his message had been cryptic. Come alone. Tell no one where you're going. The cafe was nearly empty on that Wednesday morning. Rain pattered against the windows, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. I spotted Brennan immediately. He sat in the corner booth, his back to the wall, sharp eyes watching the entrance. Despite his age, he carried himself with military precision. Mr. Brennan? I approached cautiously, extending my hand. He shook it firmly, his grip surprisingly strong. Sit down, Mr. Mitchell, and please, call me Tom. His voice was gravelly, but clear. You said you found something that belonged to your grandfather. I carefully removed the photograph from my jacket pocket, still protected in its archival sleeve. As I laid it on the table between us, I watched his reaction closely. The color drained from his face. His hands, which had been steady moments before, began to tremble. He stared at the image for a full minute without speaking, and I noticed his jaw clench repeatedly. Where did you get this? His voice was barely a whisper. My grandfather's attic. It was in a box with other photos from the war. Tom, what am I looking at? He pushed the photograph back toward me, glancing around the cafe nervously. Put that away, now. I complied, confused and increasingly concerned. Tom, please, if you know something. There are things about that day that were classified at the highest levels, he interrupted, his voice low and urgent. Things that were supposed to stay classified forever. Your grandfather was one of the photographers who saw them. We all signed papers, swore oaths. Most of us took those secrets to our graves. But what is it? Who were those soldiers? Tom leaned forward, his eyes intense. In early 1944, there was a program. Code name wasn't even written down, just referred to as the Auxiliary. It was experimental, controversial, and involved personnel from a country that, well, let's just say official recognition would have caused significant political complications. My mind raced. You mean Allied forces that weren't publicly acknowledged? The politics of war are messy, James. Can I call you James? He didn't wait for my answer. Not all of our allies were allies in the public eye. There were arrangements, agreements, people who fought alongside us but could never be officially recognized. The vehicles and uniforms in that photo belonged to men who were there, who bled on that beach, but who officially never existed. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Why? Why hide their contribution? Because acknowledging them would have meant acknowledging relationships that were politically inconvenient, would have meant answering questions that had no good answers. The decision was made at the highest levels to classify their involvement. He paused, taking a shaky breath. A lot of good men died to keep that secret, James. Your grandfather lived with that weight his entire life, but it's been 80 years. Surely, some secrets don't have expiration dates. Tom's expression hardened. I'm telling you this as a warning. If you dig into this, if you try to expose what's in that photograph, you'll encounter resistance. Not just from government archives, but from people who believe some truths are too dangerous to reveal. Are you saying I'm in danger? I'm saying you need to think very carefully about what you do next. He stood slowly, supporting himself on the table's edge. Your grandfather kept that photo hidden for a reason. He could have destroyed it, but he didn't. Maybe he wanted the truth to come out someday. Or maybe he just couldn't bring himself to erase those men from history entirely. Either way, the choice is yours now. He started to walk away, then turned back. There's a historian at Georgetown University, Dr. Sarah Chen. She specializes in classified World War II operations. If you're determined to pursue this, she might be able to help. But James, he fixed me with a serious stare. Once you start down this path, you can't unknow what you learn, and not everyone will thank you for bringing it to light. With that, he left, moving slowly through the rain-soaked parking lot. I sat there for another hour, the photograph burning a hole in my pocket, Tom's words echoing in my mind. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding. I went through the rest of my grandfather's box more carefully, looking for anything else that might explain the photograph. Hidden at the very bottom, beneath a layer of old newspaper, I found a journal. The entries were sporadic, written in the same careful handwriting as the photo labels. Most were mundane observations about daily life during the war, but as I flipped through the pages, one entry stopped me cold. It was dated June 7th, 1944, the day after D-Day. I photographed something today I can never speak of. Men who fought as bravely as any American, who died on that beach alongside our boys, but who will never be remembered. Colonel Patterson took most of my negatives, but I kept one. I don't know why. Maybe because someone should know they were there. Maybe because forgetting them seems like another kind of death. God forgive me if keeping this photo endangers anyone, but God forgive me more if I let these men disappear from history without a trace. My hands were shaking as I read those words. My grandfather had struggled with the same dilemma I faced now. He'd made his choice. Now I had to make mine. I spent the rest of the night researching Dr. Sarah Chen. She had an impressive background, dozens of published papers on classified military operations, and a reputation for tenacity. Her university profile listed office hours for the following afternoon. As I finally crawled into bed at 3 in the morning, I knew I'd already made my decision. Tom was right about one thing. I couldn't unknow what I'd learned, but my grandfather had carried this burden alone for decades. Maybe it was time for the truth to finally surface. Dr. Sarah Chen's office was exactly what I expected from a historian obsessed with uncovering hidden truths. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, stacked in precarious towers on her desk, and scattered across 2 chairs meant for visitors. The morning sunlight streaming through her window illuminated dust particles dancing in the air, and the smell of old paper and strong coffee dominated the small space. She was younger than I anticipated, probably in her early 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind frameless glasses. When I'd emailed her the previous night, simply saying I had questions about classified D-Day operations, she'd responded within an hour, telling me to come by during her office hours. "Mr. Mitchell, please move those books and have a seat," she said, gesturing at one of the buried chairs. Her accent carried traces of her Taiwanese heritage. "Your email was intriguingly vague. You mentioned something about D-Day." I carefully relocated a stack of books about the Office of Strategic Services and sat down. For a moment, I hesitated. Tom's warning echoed in my mind, but I'd come this far. "Dr. Chen, what I'm about to show you, I was told it's sensitive, potentially dangerous to pursue." Her expression shifted from curious to intensely focused. Dangerous how? I'm not entirely sure. I removed the photograph from my bag and handed it to her. This was taken by my grandfather on D-Day. He was a combat photographer. I found it after he passed away. Dr. Chen took the photo, and I watched as she went through the same process I had. Initial, casual observation, then growing attention to detail, then shock. She grabbed a magnifying glass from her desk drawer and studied the image for several minutes, in silence. "Where exactly did you find this?" Her voice was calm, but I could hear the underlying excitement. "His attic in a locked box with other photographs. Most of them were standard war photos, nothing unusual, but this one..." I trailed off. She set down the magnifying glass and looked at me directly. "Mr. Mitchell, do you understand what you have here?" Tom Brennan, a veteran who served in my grandfather's division, suggested these were part of a classified program. He called it the Auxiliary. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. "You spoke with Tom Brennan? He actually talked to you about this? You know him?" "I've tried to interview him 3 times over the past 5 years. He's refused every time, said he had nothing to say about classified operations." She returned her attention to the photograph. "If Tom talked to you, that's significant. He was part of the intelligence apparatus during the war. If anyone would know about something like this, it would be him." She stood and moved to one of her filing cabinets, pulling out a thick folder. "I've spent 15 years researching anomalies in the official D-Day records. There are gaps, inconsistencies, reports that were heavily redacted or completely removed from the archives. I've always suspected there were participants whose involvement was deliberately obscured. Do you know who they were? Dr. Chen spread several documents across her desk, each marked with various classification stamps. Most of them now declassified but still partially redacted. I have theories. In 1943 and early 1944, there were diplomatic channels opening with several nations that weren't yet publicly allied with us. Some of these negotiations involved military cooperation, but the political situation was delicate. She pointed to one particular document, a memo from the Office of Strategic Services, dated March 1944. Most of it was blacked out, but one paragraph remained visible. The proposed integration of foreign personnel into designated operations requires highest-level clearance and absolute operational security. Public acknowledgement is not advised at this time or in the foreseeable future. Foreign personnel, I repeated. But from where? That's the question I've been trying to answer for years. Your grandfather's photograph might be the first concrete evidence. She grabbed a laptop and started typing rapidly. There were several nations that had complex relationships with the Allies. Some provided resources, intelligence, or even troops, but for various political reasons, their involvement couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Over the next 2 hours, Dr. Chen walked me through her research. She showed me intercepted communications, decoded messages, and logistical records that hinted at the presence of unidentified units during the Normandy invasion. She'd even found references to equipment requisitions that didn't match any known Allied forces. The problem, she explained, is that every time I get close to identifying these forces, I hit a wall. Documents are still classified, witnesses have passed away or refused to talk, and certain government agencies become very interested in my research. Interested how? She gave me a wry smile. Let's just say I've had some uncomfortable conversations with people who strongly suggested I focus my research elsewhere. Nothing threatening, just persistent encouragement to explore other topics. Tom warned me about that. He said some people believe this truth is too dangerous to reveal. And he might be right. Dr. Chen leaned back in her chair. But here's the thing, James. History isn't just about recording what happened. It's about acknowledging everyone who played a role. If there were soldiers who fought on that beach, who died alongside American troops, they deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve to know. So what do? We verify everything we can. Your photograph is extraordinary, but it's not enough by itself. We need corroborating evidence. I have contacts at the National Archives, former military historians, even a few retired intelligence officers who've hinted they know more than they've said. With this photograph as leverage, maybe we can finally get some answers. She paused, studying me carefully. But I need to know you're committed to this. Once we start making inquiries with this evidence, people will notice. Your name will be attached to this discovery. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my grandfather, about the weight he'd carried for 80 years. I thought about the men in that photograph, forever frozen in that moment of courage and sacrifice, but erased from official history. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. Dr. Chen smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely excited. Then let's get to work. First, we need to have this photograph authenticated. I know a forensic specialist who works with historical documents. If this image is genuine and unaltered, that's our foundation. Then we start digging through every archive, every declassified document, every possible source, until we find the truth. She handed the photograph back to me carefully. Guard this with your life, James. Make high-quality digital copies and store them in multiple secure locations. This might be the only physical evidence that exists. As I left her office that afternoon, the weight of what we were undertaking settled on my shoulders. This wasn't just academic research anymore. This was about justice, about memory, about ensuring that sacrifice wasn't forgotten simply because it was politically convenient. The Virginia sky was overcast as I walked to my car, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was paranoia, the natural result of Tom's warnings and Dr. Chen's stories about government interest in her research. But as I drove home, I couldn't help checking my rearview mirror more often than usual. That night, I followed Dr. Chen's advice. I made multiple high-resolution scans of the photograph, uploaded encrypted copies to 3 different cloud storage services, and even mailed a physical copy to my attorney with instructions to open it only if something happened to me. It felt melodramatic, like something from a spy movie, but better safe than sorry. I also went back through my grandfather's journal, reading every entry more carefully. Most were mundane, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that now took on new meaning. Saw Patterson today. He's still nervous about the photos. They're sending someone from Washington to ask questions. Hope I remember the approved answers. Sometimes I wonder if keeping silent makes me complicit in forgetting them. My grandfather had lived with this secret, this burden, for his entire adult life. Now it was my turn to carry it, but unlike him, I had a choice. I could let it stay buried, or I could fight to bring it into the light. As I fell asleep that night, I'd already made my decision. The fight was just beginning. 2 months had passed since that meeting in Dr. Chen's office, and they'd been the most intense weeks of my life. The photograph had been authenticated by 3 independent forensic specialists. All confirmed it was genuine, unaltered, and dated correctly to June 6, 1944. That was our foundation. From there, Dr. Chen and I worked tirelessly, diving into newly declassified documents, conducting interviews with elderly veterans, and following every possible lead. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired CIA analyst named Margaret Foster, who'd spent 30 years working with classified World War II files before they were declassified. We met her at a quiet restaurant in Annapolis on a sunny April morning. She was 78, sharp as a tack, and when Dr. Chen showed her the photograph, recognition flashed immediately across her face. "I wondered if these images still existed," Margaret said softly, holding the photo with reverent care. "I saw references to them in the files, but they'd all been marked as destroyed. What can you tell us?" I asked, my heart pounding. Margaret looked around the restaurant, then leaned in closer. "What I'm about to tell you is no longer classified, but it's still sensitive. In 1943, there were secret negotiations with several South American nations. Some of them had large populations of European immigrants who wanted to fight against the Axis powers, but whose home countries were occupied or neutral. South American forces?" Dr. Chen's eyes widened. "At D-Day. A small contingent, yes. Mostly volunteers trained in secret, equipped by us, but kept completely off the official books. The political situation was complicated. Some of these nations were officially neutral, and acknowledging they were providing troops would have created diplomatic nightmares. Others had internal politics that made public acknowledgement impossible." She tapped the photograph gently. "These men were brave, skilled, and absolutely committed. They landed at Omaha Beach as part of the second wave, tasked with specific objectives, but officially, they were never there. The few records that existed were classified at the highest levels and scheduled for destruction. Why?" I felt anger rising in my chest. "Why erase their contribution? Because international politics are messy, James. Because acknowledging them would have required explaining agreements that were never meant to be public. Because once the war ended, it was easier to maintain the fiction than to explain the truth." Margaret's expression was pained. "I'm not saying it was right. I'm just telling you why it happened." Dr. Chen was taking notes frantically. "Do you have names, units, anything concrete?" "In my personal papers, kept separate from official channels, yes. I documented everything I found before those files were destroyed. I always hoped someone would ask the right questions someday." She smiled at me. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, James." Over the following weeks, with Margaret's help, we pieced together the full story. The unit in the photograph was composed of volunteers from Brazil and Argentina, men with German and Italian heritage who'd fled Europe and wanted to fight for the Allied cause. They'd trained for months in Panama, integrated with American forces, and landed at Omaha Beach alongside the 1st Infantry Division. 23 of them died on that beach. Another 47 were wounded. They fought with courage and determination, but when the war ended, they were quietly sent home with American decorations that were never officially recorded. Their families were told to keep silent, and most did, taking the secret to their graves. Dr. Chen and I prepared a comprehensive paper documenting everything we'd found. We included my grandfather's photograph, Margaret's records, testimony from the few surviving veterans we'd located, and dozens of supporting documents. It was meticulous, irrefutable, and powerful. The day we submitted it for publication in the Journal of Military History, I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. This was what my grandfather had wanted, whether he'd fully realized it or not. He'd kept that photograph for 80 years, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to bring the truth forward. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, major news outlets picked up the story. Historians debated its implications. Government officials, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. Some denied it, others confirmed it reluctantly, and a few praised us for bringing hidden history to light. But the most meaningful responses came from families. Descendants of those South American volunteers reached out, sharing stories their grandparents had told them in whispers, pieces of a puzzle they'd never fully understood. One woman from São Paulo sent me a photograph of her grandfather wearing an American uniform, taken secretly before he shipped out. "He told me he fought at Normandy," she wrote, "but when I searched for his name in the records, I found nothing. Thank you for proving he wasn't lying." Standing in my grandfather's old house 3 months after the publication, I looked again at that photograph that had started everything. The faces staring back at me were no longer anonymous. We'd identified 12 of them, found their families, told their stories. My grandfather's journal had one final entry I'd discovered, written just weeks before he died. "I'm old now, and my memories fade, but I'll never forget those men on that beach. If anyone finds the photograph I kept, I hope they'll understand why I couldn't destroy it. Some truths are too important to bury, even if revealing them comes with a cost. Maybe someday, someone braver than me will tell their story." I traced my fingers over his words, feeling the connection across the years. "I told their story, Grandpa," I whispered to the empty room. "They won't be forgotten anymore." The afternoon sun streamed through the attic window, illuminating dust particles in golden light. Outside, the world continued its daily rhythm, unchanged yet somehow different. History had been corrected, if only slightly. 23 names had been added to the rolls of those who fell at Omaha Beach. Families had closure. Truth had emerged from decades of shadow. As I packed up the last of my grandfather's belongings, I understood something he'd probably known all along. Keeping secrets can protect people, but it can also erase them. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is refuse to let important truths remain buried, even when revealing them is difficult, complicated, or inconvenient. The photograph that shouldn't exist had changed everything we knew about D-Day, but more importantly, it had given voice to silent heroes and dignity to forgotten sacrifice. And in doing so, it had honored my grandfather's final, unspoken wish. I locked the attic door behind me, the empty metal box under my arm. Its contents had sparked a revelation, rewritten history, and restored memory to those who deserved it. Sometimes that's all we can do. Remember, honor, and ensure that bravery is never forgotten, no matter how deeply it's been buried. The story was told, the truth was known, and somewhere, I hoped, my grandfather was finally at peace.